Hi, and welcome to Module 19 in our course of Introduction to Speech and Language Development. This week, we are going to continue our discussion about the school age years and all the growing that happens during that time. So some of the vocabulary for you to pay particular attention to this week are semantics, chunking, horizontal expansion, vertical expansion, retrieval. You'll hear me talk about an acronym called HOT that refers to higher order thinking, figurative language, metaphors, idioms, similes, and proverbs. Okay, so we've talked about how pragmatics is a significant area of growth during the school age years. Well, one of the other significant areas of growth is in the area of semantics, or word knowledge, word meaning, the knowledge of words and how to use them. You can essentially think of semantics as a synonym. You might think of it as vocabulary. We are going to talk again about the impact of the caregiver, and it's not just the quality or type of words the caregiver uses, but also the quantity of words used by the caregiver has been shown to have a very significant impact both on the language development of a young child and on their academic success. Once a child gets to school, one of their primary caregivers is the classroom teacher. That makes sense, right? The child is there for up to 6 to 7 hours of educational time a day. And while they spend time there, maybe beyond that, their educational time might encompass about 6 hours a day. Their exposure to words from their caregiver, from their classroom teacher, is extensive. So we see a couple of roles of caregivers here, right? We see the caregiver in the home environment, and we see the caregiver in the school setting. The child will be asked to attend to the words that the classroom teacher is presenting. They're going to have to sort them into those schema we talked about, those categories. They're going to have to store the information effectively so that they can then retrieve the information when they are tested or assessed or when they need to use it. So we're going to take a look at the next two slides, and I want you to kind of think about the world of words that a child is exposed to in school. Let's take a look at some of this, okay? So we think of animals. All right, tell me all the animals you can think of. And often if I ask you guys as a class to tell me animals, go ahead, you might go dog, cat, horse, cow. Probably some of the earliest ones you stored as a young child are going to be the ones that come out first. So you've stored them deeply. You have lots of meaning attached to dog and cat. You have several levels of understanding of what those words are. What might be less familiar to you is mollusks, sea stars. That might not be the first vocabulary that comes to your mind when I ask you to think of animals. That's because you don't have those stored as deeply as you might some of the more familiar vocabulary, some of the ones you've experienced more often, more frequently. You've stored more information about those things. But young children are exposed to this type of vocabulary on a daily basis within the classroom, right? And so they're going to have to add information about what a fish is, what a reptile is, what an amphibian is. They're going to be asked to compare them, list features of them. What's the difference between a mammal and a reptile? So those comparison contrasts. And each time they add information, that understanding gets stored deeper and deeper. Well, it's not just the words themselves, right? It's not just the labels of the objects, but let's just talk about just the understanding of words. So when we talk about Cow, we might also talk about grazing, and then you have to understand the verb of grazing, or the word udder, meaning, that's a piece of a cow. You have to understand beef and the concept of that is a meat that comes from a cow. You have to understand that a bull would be a he, and that it has a gender with it, and so that's a pronoun that you would use to describe it. You would say a sentence like the cows and goats, so you might use a conjunction to combine animals that are found in one place. So it's not just the vocabulary of the nouns, it's also all of the word pieces that go into how we describe the words we know. So you can see that actual vocabulary acquisition is more than just labels. It's labels embedded within functional language so we can express our ideas and our understanding. When we talk about vocabulary acquisition, you have to realize that the acquisition of the vocabulary certainly comes from the home. But in the school setting, while it does come from the classroom, it's also going to come from the playground, the office, an assembly. And in each of these environments, the child is bombarded with new words. Okay, so I want you to watch this quick lecture, right? And listen to how many new words are presented in this lecture. What you're going to see here is an example of metalinguistics, in that you have to be able to talk about talking, the idea to talk about talking in order to understand what he's talking about. And you remember when we talked about metalinguistics in the past few weeks.
Hi, welcome again to ingvid.com. My name's Adam. Today we're going to look at something that I get asked about all the time. Sorry about that, I lost my cap there. Okay, so students ask me all the time, what's the difference between though, although, and even though, and despite and in spite of? Very simple. It's not as complicated as everybody thinks. First, let's start with these three. These three, though, although, and even though, these are used with adverb clauses. Now, just to refresh your memory, what is a clause? A clause is any group of words that has a subject and a verb. It must have a subject and a verb. And these three are used to show contrast. So what does all this mean in general? You're going to have a long sentence. This sentence is going to have two clauses. One clause will have this adverb marker in it. The other clause will be an independent clause, means it's a sentence that can stand by itself. What this does is it shows a contrast, or something that's very different from one clause to the other clause. So within that one sentence, you have contrasting ideas like positive and negative, or you think this is going to happen, but really that happens, something very different from what you expect, okay? Despite and in spite of, these are prepositions. And they are used with a phrase. Now, what is a phrase? A phrase is also a group of words, but it doesn't need to have a subject and a verb. It can have a noun, or it can have a verb, or it can have neither. But usually it has at least one, or a gerund, but we'll get to that. But it also shows contrast. Okay, before I give you some example sentences to understand.
Okay, so you get the idea, right? Think about being a child in a classroom and listening to that lecture, right? So we're going to say, even if it was an advanced educational environment, let's say freshman year in high school, do you hear the complexity of language that is happening in this lecture, that a child is going to have to sort and organize the words they know around the words they don't know in order to be able to understand the content? One of the other impacts on vocabulary acquisition is the language of written text. When we talk about the written text, we find that the language is much different than what we use in everyday communication or conversation, right? So what we see is a connection between how much a child reads and is read to and their expansive vocabulary knowledge. So let's look at this little excerpt here from Charlotte's Web. And everybody stood at the pig pen and stared at the web and read the word over and over, while Wilbur, who felt terrific inside, stood quietly swelling out his chest. You can see that in this short excerpt, a child is going, this is, second, third grade, well, probably closer to third grade reading material. And often read is what they call a trade book. In other words, it's read like everyone in the classroom has a copy and they all read it together, sort of that popcorn reading where they go around the room and everyone takes a turn. So while the child is reading this or listening to it being read to them, they have already experienced figurative language, swelling out his chest, novel language such as admiration, journeyed, and wondrous. And these are words that are not typically heard in our everyday conversation, right? So the language of the written word expands the child's understanding of vocabulary in general. But as the child's reading this, they also have to comprehend the story. So they're going to have to rely on context to help them understand and manage words that might not be familiar to them, such as the word swelling. So stood quietly swelling out his chest. Well, right before that, it says, who really felt terrific. So they're going to associate really felt terrific with something wonderful. Therefore, quietly swelling out his chest might be related to something positive, like pride. Interestingly, social class also has a great impact on vocabulary acquisition. And what we find is by the time the child is 3 years old, a child who is exposed to the culture of a high socioeconomic status versus one who is in a low socioeconomic status has experienced or uses twice as many vocabulary words as the child who is in the lower socioeconomic environment. So that's just in the words that they say. What we know is their actual exposure to words is in the tens of thousands, that their just exposure to the quantity of words is extremely different based off of social class. Communities have a great impact on the learning of vocabulary. So a child's participation outside the home. Community doesn't just mean your neighborhood. It doesn't just mean your cultural influences. It also means, your religious experience, your talents and hobbies, your family's interests, and how they spend their vacation time or their downtime, their weekend time, what's valued by the family. Anytime you have a shared group or a group that has a shared interest, you are essentially talking about a community. And each of them brings with them a vocabulary that is specific to that environment. Take, for example, ballet class that we have here, right? Plie is a term that a very young future ballerina might be very familiar with. Porte au bras or porte de bras, meaning position of the arms, might be something that they become familiar with. And even while it's not English, it is a term that they might be familiar with because of that community. Likewise, a child who is in a musical setting might become familiar with words like half notes and treble clef and rhythm and musical parts like alto, bass, tenor. They might become familiar with that vocabulary at a very young age. So you can see the extensive impact of just communities on a child's learning of new vocabulary. So how? These are all the environments. These are all the impacts of learning, right? But how is it that children learn? Well, it seems easy to assume that they learn from adult models, and they do. So a child comes to the adult and says, what does whatever mean? What does superlative mean? And the adult's response is, go look it up. Or we tell them what it means. As a speech pathologist, I tend to tell children to look it up in a thesaurus, not a dictionary. Dictionary is words to talk about words, whereas a thesaurus at least gives them synonyms, so they might be able to find a word that seems familiar. Use of clues in embedded context. I talked a little bit about that in the Wilbur story. That often words that we don't know are embedded in a context with which we are familiar. So we use the context of what's happening to help us decode and figure out what this unknown is about. And then they use their existing morphological knowledge to determine what other words might mean. So I know based off of the position in the sentence if it is a noun, if it's an adverb, if it's an adjective, if it's a verb. For example, in this sentence, I saw a oiseau. I know oiseau is a noun based off of its position in the sentence, that it follows the article, that I know that that's what it would be, even though I may not know what the word oiseau is. Based off of context, if I expanded that and I said, I saw a oiseau, it was sitting in the tree outside cooing. One of its feathers fell to the ground right below its nest. You would now have enough context, number 2, right there, use of context clues, to determine that it is a, I hope you all said bird. Think too of perspective. Children have, learn perspective over time, learning to take things from somebody else's point of view, and that helps them also learn how to decode information. As their vocabulary expands, it doesn't just magically happen one night, right? It goes from feature and function. So if you ask a child, a very young child, to tell you what something is, they will often define it by function. So if you ask them, what's a ball? They'll say you play with it. What's a shirt? You wear it. What's a milk? You drink it. And they describe it by function versus by other features. They learn to start adding features over time. They learn to start categorizing. So then they learn that an apple is a fruit. They start considering that you can even categorize it in other ways. That's that depth of understanding. Remember when we talked about your depth of knowledge about a cat and a dog? Your depth of knowledge about apples is equally rich. So you also know that apples are healthy. So these more abstract, more deep ideas of how to store information about an apple solidify what apple is in your head. At first, their definitions are things they can see, touch, experience. And over time, they're better able to describe things like feelings. What is sad? What is anxious? Eventually, they learn to be figurative in their explanation. And so they can take the word and use it in a more hypothetical way, or for sarcasm, or for using a idiom, or perhaps it's embedded in a proverb of some kind. And they start to learn how to use that word in a way other than something super concrete. As a child grows, they come from this very young place where they have one word that means something, and their definitions have a hard time moving from that one definition. If you've ever run into a little one where you've trying to explain something and you give them a word, they're like, no, that's not what it is. And actually they're just unfamiliar with your vocabulary. I had an experience recently where I told a 2.5-year-old, I said, oh, you are very kind. And she responded, no, I'm not. obviously not understanding that I was giving her a compliment because kind was a word that she wasn't familiar with. To her, it seemed accusational. So while we are talking about school-age children, you're still going to run into that same kind of experience, right? Where children have this one definition of what a word means, and they have to grow into their understanding of how words actually might have different meanings. So here's this lovely video, I'm sure you've seen it before, of how one child interprets the moisture falling from the sky as sprinkling, and the other one has a definition of it being raining, and they have a little tussle here. Each not negotiating.
No. It's raining. No, it's sprinkling. No, it's raining. My mom told me it's sprinkling. It was raining. No. Yes, it is. My mom told me it was sprinkling, not raining. My mom said it is raining. No, my mom told me it was sprinkling. Because my mom said it's raining. No, my mom said it's raining. My mom said it's raining. My mom said it's. Say sorry to me.
Okay, so you see the influence of the adult model there, right? My mommy said, well, the same thing my teacher said, and they'll come home with explaining what the teacher said, even to mom and dad. Well, my teacher said this, and this is that more narrow understanding of their definition, and that grows through those steps of function and feature from concrete to abstract to figurative over the school age years. They really don't have a really solid way of using, of using vocabulary fully until well into adolescence. So now we're going to talk about how does this process happen? It happens through two functions, through horizontal expansion and through vertical expansion. So when we do horizontal expansion, what we are actually doing is adding semantic distinction. What that means is while blue is a concept most young children understand, variations of blue, such as periwinkle, sapphire, powder blue, and navy, evolve over time by distinction. We vary them because we agree that there are variations of blue, and the variation of blue is by distinction. Things become more distinct. In the same manner that cat is distinguished by calico, Siamese, tabby, lion, leopard, each holding their own unique features, yet still holding cat as their basis. So blue and cat are those core vocabulary words. And then the expansion is the fringe vocabulary, the ones that maybe not everybody learns in the same way, but they understand that blue still holds its blueness. We could all look at something, is that blue? Yes. Now, can we have a semantic discussion about what type of blue? We certainly can. It's cobalt, it's periwinkle, it's sapphire. You know, ask any bride who's planning their wedding, very specific shades of blue, right? Cat, you can point to a line, is that a cat? Yes. Point to a leopard, is that a cat? Yes. The agreement on that core vocabulary stays the same, but the expansion of it adds distinction. And over time, children start to distinguish. Remember in that first chart where we looked about animals and how it was separated out into vertebrates and invertebrates? This is where that horizontal expansion starts to happen. Vertical expansion is where we add meanings to one word. So a word in our language actually can have many meanings. So the word duck can mean get out of the way, or it can mean the animal that floats on a lake and goes quack, quack. Both are duck, but our vertical understanding changes changes with time, in that we understand you can use one word to mean two different things. Another couple of examples here are change, meaning to alter or make different, and then the coins in your pocket. Now, don't mistake vertical expansion meaning that I use the word change in a different sentence. So for example, I changed a tire, I changed my clothes, I changed my class. None of those are vertical expansion. All you did was take the word change, meaning to alter or make different, and put it in 3 different sentences. The meaning of the word stayed the same. You made something different. So in order to have vertical expansion, you have to change the meaning, the inherent meaning in the core word. So again, I'm going to refer you back to that first graph I gave you where it talked about animals and you saw all those different types. It had reptiles and amphibians and mollusks and mammals. It's a lot of vocabulary that we throw at kids. What's imperative is that they learn how to store it, because without effective storage, they can't possibly retrieve it when it comes time to either use the word effectively or functionally, or to be assessed on it, which really is what school is a lot about, right? We assess, I'm assessing you guys weekly on your vocabulary knowledge. So it's imperative that you store it effectively. That's why I give you examples, so that that helps solidify your understanding of what the word means. Chunking is one of the ways that we store effectively, and we use semantic relationships in order to store. So let's use that animal chart again. If I say mammals, now tell me all the mammals you can think of, you're specific to talking about mammals, right? You didn't include that in that list, any reptiles, nor did you include any invertebrates. If I said, tell me all the insects you can think of, you wouldn't tell me cow and goat. Why? Because based off of the category of insects, you have stored things under that header that tell you 6 legs, 3 body parts, head, thorax, abdomen, and you will retrieve that information based off of their semantic features. Effective chunking helps with retrieval. Its purpose is to store. But why do we store? In order to retrieve. As speech pathologists, we often use chunking in therapy to teach kids how to store and manage the massive amounts of vocabulary they're exposed to on a daily basis. There's many different ways we can chunk information. You can chunk it by grammatical features. So which is which is an example of how we might vary by grammar. One of them being a question word, one of them being a noun. Multiple meaning words. Attributes. If I said cloud, cotton ball, and milk, what are they all? They are all, and hopefully you said things that are white. So I'm categorizing that information by feature. Context, if I said denominator, integer, and quotient, you understand that those are terms that I use based off of the context. If I'm talking about math class, those make sense. If I'm in my language class talking about Shakespeare, none of those make sense. We have social group vocabulary that we store and that we use only with a certain group of people. Terms that we use only on social media. And then word association. One word leads to another, which leads to another, which leads to another. Sort of that depth of understanding. We talk about the galaxy. I say, tell me all the things you can think of about the galaxy. And your knowledge might be expansive because I just kind of gave you a giant word. It's the idea of brainstorming, right? I just write one word on the board and you just tell me everything you know. That's just the retrieval of all of the information you have stored. So remember, while chunking, we do that in order to store. The purpose of storage is to retrieve. So how do I facilitate, now that I've helped a child store the information, so that's that receptive language piece, okay, I'm putting it together, how you understand it. I now have to help you bring it back out, right? So ways that I help you bring it back out is by teaching you to store it effectively. I teach you to chunk it in groups of like features, attributes, categories, word associations. I might help you retrieve the word you're looking for by giving you a sound cue. So this is a green fruit that many people call a vegetable. We make guacamole out of it, and it's called an av is a sound cue or an auditory cue for avocado. I'm not going to get into an argument about whether that's a fruit or a vegetable, right? Visual cues. Sometimes if you can't think of the word, I can show you a picture. We also use visual cues because a person, if I ask you to think of your, okay, let me try this. If I said, imagine Harry Potter, you should have created an image in your head. An image in your head should pop up based off of either your experience with the book, your experience through social media or the TV, or your actual experience in the movies. You get a visual image. So visual imagery is something we actually use with retrieval of information. When we teach children with a diagram, it's important to use that diagram in the test so that they now associate the word knowledge with that picture. How often I use the word will facilitate how quickly it comes up out of retrieval. And then that I keep my vocabulary separate so there's not a lot of confusion that complicates it. Now, in this particular course, the word semanticity and semantics are very close to each other, yet their definitions are very different. So that causes a difficulty with retrieval. It's important to learn that semanticity is a truth of language, whereas semantics is a category of language. They're different. They sound a lot alike, which creates confusion. Recency effect, we tend to be able to talk about what we most recently earned. So, practice and rehearsal. That's why people cram for tests. The thing that you've just been going over is more easily retrieved. Higher order thinking, whoops, I missed that there. Higher order thinking is an intellectual, cognitive, language impacted feature of learning. Not all children will be capable of the same level of higher order thinking. It is a factor of metalinguistic development. It's the ability to think about thinking, to think about talking, to talk about talking. This is where we come up with inferencing, problem solving, novel ideas, entrepreneurship, inventors are good at higher order thinking. They think that old adage of thinking outside the box. This is higher order thinking. Being able to analyze something, to process it and consider it, and then think of an alternate way of looking at it. So some of these higher order thinking skills are evidenced by a child's ability to, say, use humor, to use sarcasm, to understand figurative language or a metaphor, to be able to take a proverb and apply it to their life. And while children develop metalinguistics over time, remember that, right? There's that key development in the younger years of when metalinguistics is starting to develop. The mastery of these higher order thinking components isn't really going to be clearly established until later on in the very late middle school years, beginning junior high years. So they might be able to use humor, but not understand it. They might be able to read a book with a metaphor, but not really be able to put it into their own words to explain it. So we've talked about how this massive organization of how a child's language is evolving with their social skills, with their vocabulary, with their grammar, order, we're now going to look at, well, what's the next piece of what language looks like in a school-age child, and we're going to look at the art of narrative discourse or storytelling. Thank you all. Have a great night, and I will see you next time.